I had cared for an elderly woman with no family who came to us when her husband died. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it was usually just words that made no sense together. I felt so bad for her, because ever since she had arrived, so many of the residents in her area that she seemed to enjoy spending time with had passed in such a short time span. She put up a picture of each of them next to her pictures of her husband and several others who were probably family to remember them. I had always felt sorry for her and showed her extra attention, and we became close. It just seemed so unfair that she had such luck and kept losing people that she cared about. One day, she looked at me and said plain as day, "Sweetie, I think I'm done now," and handed me a picture. It was a picture of me. I smiled because it touched my heart that I was that important to her. She passed nearly a week later, and I cried for days. It hit me really hard. She knew it was the end for her, and she said goodbye as best she could. A little less than 2 years later, I was talking with a colleague, and she came up in conversation. My colleague referred to her as "that crazy bitch," which seemed very out of character for her, and it shocked and offended me deeply. I expressed this to her, not so nicely, and she looked at me with this shocked look and said, "Oh dear, do you not know?" and then explained something to me that I hadn't. As it turned out, it came out sometime after she had passed that she had killed her husband by poisoning him, and that there was an investigation because it appeared that she had a ritual of befriending someone, obtaining a picture of them, and hiding the picture until she could kill them, usually by poisoning, and then display the picture as sort of a trophy. It was suspected that this may have been the reason for the spike in mortality rate during her stay, and the considerable number of photos in her collection. The last I heard, the old family photos weren't any relation to her, and the police were trying to ID the individuals and compare them to several cold cases. My mom used to be an RN at a hospital in a small town. This hospital was connected to a senior living home, and at night, the RN overwatched both sides of the building, hospital and living home. She was usually the overnight RN and would have either 1 or 2 CNAs working as well. She has experienced this apparition about 6 or 7 times during her 10-year stint there, and everyone has referred to the apparition as the Man in Black. Each experience was identical, except for the location in the building. Frequently, throughout the night, she would have to do her rounds, checking vitals, etc., and would have to walk around a corner from the nurse's station/ER, towards the beds in the hospital, and towards the senior home. She would see the apparition either right after rounding the corner, or right after walking out of a room and going to the next. Outside of the next room, she would see the same apparition. It was a person in a black Old West type suit, with black cowboy boots and a worn black cowboy hat to match. The creepiest thing about this man was that his face was not very distinct. It was as though a man's face was drawn with charcoal and slightly smeared, making it blurry. He was about 6'5" and would tower over her 5'5", but whenever she would see him, whether it's 10 feet or 3 feet away, he would stand there looking at her and then turn and walk into the room he was outside of. When she would walk into that room, he wasn't there. The first few times scared her into a panic, but she slowly just went on without letting it freak her out. The kicker was, around 80 to 90% of the time that the apparition was seen, that patient's health would deteriorate in the next few days, and a lot of the time that patient would pass shortly after. So whenever the overnight RN saw the Man in Black, extra precautions would be taken with that patient. Another weird thing about the apparition is that it is always seen by just the RN. Not a single CNA has personally seen him. My mom always said that he knew who would be able to help the most at the time. I, on the other hand, took it as the complete opposite. I always thought that it was almost to mock the RNs, because he would let them know that something was going to happen, but they could not do anything about it. Even though I have not seen him, it still creeps me out every time I walk down the halls, and she points out where she has. I worked at a hospital doing transport for a couple of years. The transport home base was in the basement of the hospital, where all the laundry is done, and supplies are also sorted there. I hated working late nights after this incident. On this particular night, I was the only one in the basement when I heard whistling at the end of the hallway by the elevator. I poked my head around the corner, expecting to see my only coworker on duty that night, but there was absolutely no one there. I shrugged it off. I'm not easily spooked. Nights are slow, so I ate some snacks and hung out in the break room for a bit. Next thing I know, I hear a loud bang. I walked into the hallway and a bed is rolling down the hall, bumping into the sides. At this point, I think that my coworker is bullshitting me. I radio him, and he says he's upstairs in the cafeteria. Oh, okay. I still don't believe him, and think I'll catch him in the act. I walk past the laundry room and the machines start. I pop my head in there expecting to find him, but it's completely empty. Okay, starting to get a little nervous. I walk into the laundry room, and the machines completely stop. I freeze, then run out and head towards the elevator when I hear whistling again. At this point, I know I am the only worker in the basement. As I'm standing there waiting for the elevator, things start falling off of the shelves down the hall. Boxes of gloves, tissues, packages of tubes. I am literally standing there watching them fall off one by one at the opposite end of the hallway. I shit you not, my entire body broke out in goosebumps. My hair stood on end, and I had this strong gut feeling I was being watched. I was not alone. As I'm getting into the elevator, I feel what feels like someone brushing up against my arm. I went upstairs and found my coworker in the cafeteria, told him how freaked out I was, and got the fuck out of there. I transferred soon after that. The creepy thing to add to it is that I usually whistle mindlessly to myself at work. It was almost as if the spirit was mimicking me. Creepiest feeling ever. It was the summer of 2008 when I was in the middle of medical school rotations. Between the months of late-night studying and never-ending piles of paperwork, that entire period of my life just felt like one big anxiety-filled blur, fueled by coffee and Red Bull. But one thing that stands out so vividly in my mind to this day was the time I rotated to an abnormal psychiatry ward. My first days there were largely uneventful and filled with orientations about when the hospital was founded, which types of patients they typically deal with, and the same talking points that every hospital has. To be honest, though, that place was a half-abandoned dump, founded in the Civil War that society had forgotten about after Reagan cut funding in the 80s. The buildings all looked like 19th century plantation homes, but only a few of them were still open. All of the rest were chained up, boarded with plywood and covered in ivy and overgrowth. The best way I could describe it is eerie, and yet fitting of the ways society treats the mentally ill. When it was time to go on to the units, they informed me that I was going to be on the admissions unit. Because this was a state-run facility, the admissions unit specifically dealt with people from jails who the police felt were too crazy to stay there. Personally, I wasn't thrilled with the fact that I would be there, but life is sometimes a roller coaster, and once the bar comes down, you're not getting off until it's over. So I decided to make myself useful and get to know the patients by first reading their cases, paperwork, and backstory before actually meeting them in person. Half of them had paranoid schizophrenia with delusions of grandeur. A lot of them were bipolar, and interestingly, 3 of them were committed because of drug use but had no history of mental disorders. The first patient I met was a 50-year-old man by the name of Henry. Henry was a paranoid schizophrenic with a calm and sweet personality, highly cognizant but simultaneously suffering from severe delusions and hallucinations. Many of the other patients disliked Henry, because he would frequently wake up at 3 in the morning, yelling at furniture and lamps, while complaining about seeing people walking around the courtyards at night. Henry and I chatted, and when I asked him to describe the people he saw, he described them as soldiers from the Civil War. It's hard to tell what's real and what's imaginary when talking to someone experiencing extreme delusions or hallucinations, so I made a note and decided to go on to the next patients. The second patient was a man in his early 30s named Gabriel, who was suffering from bipolar disorder. He had apparently refused to take off his prison jumpsuit, and the staff at the time had given up on getting him to change clothes. To be honest, I don't blame them. He was 6'3" and 230 pounds of pure muscle. He was a manic silverback gorilla. Wanting to get on his good side, I gave him the starburst I had in my pocket, which is not allowed by the way, and started chatting about what happened and how he got here. He started telling me about how at night, when he's trying to sleep, he keeps hearing yelling and people screaming in pain, and the sound of swords clashing. Seeing that he was in his early 30s, I wrote a note saying that it could be the early onset of schizophrenia, and I told him that I would let the therapy staff know about it. The last patient I saw that day was a 20-year-old woman named Karen, who had been committed for drug use. Karen was your typical crack hoe with a troubled past. She was caught by police while on an LSD and PCP bender. Naturally, the police didn't feel like dealing with her, and so they admitted her to us. So once the drugs all wore off, she was actually good company to talk to. She swore up and down that she was going to change her life around and go back to school. And while I knew she was just saying what she had to in order to get off the psych ward, a part of me really wanted to see her succeed. As we chatted, I jokingly told her about Henry, who keeps seeing Civil War soldiers, to which she responded, "We all see those soldiers, dude. We just don't say anything because the staff won't believe us." My first reaction was that she was trying to pull a fast one on me, so I laughed and said,
"That can't be true."
She glared at me and just said, "You people are all the same," and stormed off to her room. It was 6 p.m. at that point, and I was starting to get tired, so I decided to head home. To be perfectly honest, it was scenic driving through that half-abandoned hospital in the evening. A slight orange glow over the fields really accented the buildings. I was going about 30 miles per hour on that road and was gazing at one of the water towers when out of nowhere a person ran out in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes and swerved, nearly hitting her, but just barely missed. She was a blonde nurse, wearing a starch white apron and dress like she was from a 1950s movie. I apologized profusely, but she never said a word. Didn't even acknowledge the fact that I almost ran her ass over with my car, or answer me when I asked why she was walking in the middle of a road surrounded by fields. I got back in my car and made sure she was in my rear view mirror before I started driving. I got no more than 50 feet before the engine of my piece of shit car backfired so hard it sounded like a cannon. I got out and popped the hood, but to my surprise there was nothing wrong. No smoke. No broken parts, just the same piece of shit engine. Confused, I closed the hood, and as I turned around, there were 4 men wearing Civil War uniforms, covered in blood from stab wounds and muskets. One man was even holding his own entrails before me, with a cold, blank, and emotionless stare. I was in complete shock and was frozen in place, staring at them until I heard the sound of another cannon firing from behind me. I jumped and looked over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. And when I looked forward, the 4 men were gone. I jumped in my car and got the hell off the property as fast as I could. I used to work in an outpatient surgery clinic. We had a very active ghost/poltergeist that liked to move things and call our names. One day, when we had no patients, it flipped on lights in one of the patient rooms while I was in the restroom. I could hear the cabinets banging, and the gauze container metal lids sounded like they were going up and down repeatedly. At first, I thought it was the other medical assistant in the office looking for something, But when I asked, she said she thought it was me making all the noise. So once I realized it was our resident ghost, I went in there and jokingly told it to go next door and bug someone else. About 30 seconds after I left the room, we heard 2 loud bangs. When we went to investigate, we realized the noise came from the 2 blood pressure cuffs that were on the counter had flown across the room and hit the metal bottom of the patient bed. The whole room felt cold and electrified. It made your hair stand on end. Then we heard it say in a low, gravelly voice, "No!" So we got the hell out of there. I'm a night shift nurse in a hospital in North Carolina. Before I tell my story, let me give you some background information about my hospital. There are 4 floors. The ground floor contains the lobby, gift shop, cafeteria, pharmacy, and outpatient services. The first floor has the lab, ICU, ER, and the vending machines. The second floor, where I work, is the med-surg hall. Finally, the third floor is mostly conference rooms and HR. In the past, the first floor contained our OB and pediatrics. These floors closed due to a lack of command in the community. Most nights, I have my routine down pat. I eat my lunch at midnight between medication passes and get hungry again around 3 a.m. Naturally, I run down to the vending machines on the first floor for a snack. They're by the ICU and ER, with a long hallway cutting through the empty pediatric ward separating them. The vending machine and ICU was out of order, so I decided to cut through peds to grab a snack from the other. As I walked down the dim stretch of hallway, I heard a noise. It sounded like a small child's laughter. Being the prudent nurse that I am, I started searching rooms to make sure that no one's kid was just wandering amok in the dark. I checked each room and saw no one. No TVs were on in any room. I brushed it off as my imagination and continued my trek to the other vending machine. On my way back, though, I heard the noise again and felt something tugging on the bottom of my scrub top. I broke out into a cold sweat and booked it for the elevator without turning back. When I mentioned it to the more seasoned nurses on the unit, they said that no one else goes down there by themselves for that exact reason. It is common knowledge that patients pass away in the hospital, and many nurses believe that some lost souls wander the corridors looking for companionship. Okay, so I work at a hospital in my state, and all I do is move the patients. I even move the recently deceased to our morgue. I usually like to hang out in the stairwell whenever I have free time or I'm on lunch. My department is small, only about 4 of us on the night shift, from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. Moving on from the details, in the stairwell you can hear every single sound that is made in there. It's a total of 12 stories, but only 11 are accessible to employees. Sometimes when I sit in there, people come in and out to reach different floors if the elevators are busy. Well, one night around 2:45 a.m., I was sitting on the 6th floor stairs. I didn't hear any doors open above or below me, but the sound of footsteps echoed through the stairwell. And it wasn't quiet. It was like the sound of boots stomping all the way down to the 1st floor. Keep in mind, the 1st floor is where the morgue is, and to get inside you need a key card. Only a select few have it, and I am one of them. I start to walk down the stairs to check and see if maybe the maintenance guy was just screwing around or something. As I reach the 4th floor, I hear this swooshing sound that passes right through the hole in the center that goes all the way from the top to the bottom, like if someone were to jump from the top floor. This naturally put me even more on edge, but nonetheless, I kept going down. Finally, I reached the 1st floor door, and halfway through opening it, the door slams shut, and the footsteps come running down the stairs right up behind me, and when I turn, there's nothing there. Now our hospital is always cold, but I felt the most freezing cold air fill the bottom of that stairwell. My entire body got goosebumps, and I just ran up to the next floor. With each step, It sounded like someone was right behind me, following me up to the next level. I ran into the hallway on the second floor, and when I looked back, I was alone. I felt my body immediately warm up. Since then, I don't spend time in the stairwell. I posted this a while back while I was still a lab assistant. As a nurse, I've never had a scarier experience. I'd worked in a hospital for almost 7 years then, and I have seen the life leave people's bodies and felt a presence, but I've only had one experience that truly terrified me. I used to work nights. Thinking about a large, dark hospital full of quiet, sleeping people is kinda creepy, but I never felt that way. My job is to wake people up and draw their blood. I know, I'm super popular at the hospital. There has always been a wing of the hospital that makes me uneasy. I'm an amazingly upbeat person. I love my job and the patients, but the minute I walk onto that wing, I'm uneasy, and something makes me look over my shoulder and want to leave. So one morning around 3 a.m., I go onto this wing to stick a patient. Feeling queasy, I walk into the patient's room, not knocking because it's so late. The lights are all off, and I see someone standing in the far corner. I'm immediately taken aback, but quickly think it's a nurse hanging blood or something. I look at the figure and ask, "Do you need me to come back?" No response. It turns towards the corner and just stands there with its back to me. My whole body is on edge, and I've never felt so scared in my life. I knew without a doubt it wasn't a nurse. I backed out of the room and walked towards the nurse's station. I just leaned against a wall trying to catch my breath, and a nurse asked me if I was going to be sick. Eventually, I had to go back into the patient's room and draw her blood, but this time I turned on the lights before I even stepped in. Of course, no one was there, except for the sleeping old lady. I quickly drew her blood, trying to ignore the sinking feeling that I had. I hate that wing, and that room will forever give me the tingles when I have to go into it. Psychiatric RN here. I worked in an acute care adult unit, but was sent to work with the kids one evening shift. It was after 10 p.m. All patients were in their rooms and in bed. I heard a child screaming and a psych tech trying to calm him. I ran into the room. The 7-year-old boy was hysterical. He was crying, sweating, and shaking. He said he saw something. After he settled down, he told me that he saw a white man with gray hair in a hospital gown in his room. While we discussed what he saw, the child froze in fear, tears rolling down his face. He said, "Be still. He's right behind you." We decided to address the man and tell him that the little boy was scared. The boy said the man turned around and left after that. The only thing anyone in the unit would have heard was the boy screaming at the beginning. All other discussion was in his room and quiet. Not even 3 minutes later, a 17-year-old male at the end of the hall started screaming. I ran to his room. He was standing on his bed, trying to get away from a white man in a hospital gown. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. If you want me to tell your story or read a creepypasta, email me at the address in the description. Come follow me on Twitter and Instagram at CoreyRhino. Also, I'm pretty sure that some of you noticed that I was, for some of the stories, real, laid back. And the reason for that is I've had some comments recently where people wish I would read like I did in the beginning. So let me know if you liked the laid back, kind of slower reading. Anyways. Anyways, be... Anyways. Anyways, be good to animals, even people. See ya. Let's fire that skit up. Masses? What are you doing out there?
Hey Tom, how's it going?
Not so good, guys.
Oh, what's the matter?
I think everyone should sit down. I'm terminally ill.
Oh my god.
Doctors say I have about 6 months to.
Hey, what the hell, Dan?
What?
Tom's telling us that he's dying and you're having a snack attack.
My bad, go ahead.
So, like I was saying, the doctors say I have about 6 months to live. And I'm just really gonna need you guys for support. Just people around me that care. Alright, you know what? Forget it. Go to hell, Dan.
God, what a drama queen.
Ja, snämma, bärksbes, hrish.
Okay, Calabaloo, Calabazoo, yo. What? What's out there? What is it? What is it? Was it a snake? Was it a squirrel? Jesus.